superhero games have had a long and somewhat inconsistent history. It wasn't that long ago when superhero games were more often than not complete crap, and even to this day it's not a surefire thing that they're gonna be good. But the batting average is high enough, and superheroes are enough of a fixture in pop culture that superhero games more than ever have the ability to have hype on a mainstream level and deliver. But the topic of superhero games goes back almost as far as the dawn of video games themselves, and one question that many will have their own opinion on is, what was the first truly great superhero game? As a matter of fact, let me know what you think was the first truly great superhero game in the comments. In a modern sense, many will say the Batman Arkham games defined a generation of games within the genre, and I think the Arkham games were the first to be successful on a mainstream level. But to me, I think that distinction of being the first truly great superhero game, or games, belongs to the 1-2 punch of Spider-Man and Spider-Man 2 Enter Electro. In fact, I would almost go as far as to say that the 5th generation of Spider-Man games walked so that modern Spider-Man games could run. More on that later. And since the modern Spider-Man games have been in the news quite a lot recently, now is as good of a time as any to look back at these 5th generation gems. Now, we're going to be taking a look at the PS1 versions of both of these games just for the sake of consistency, but if you want the definitive experience of the first game at least, go with the Dreamcast version. Now, starting with the first game, as archaic as it is these days, it still is a really fun time. I mean, just look at the plot. Among other things, this game includes an imposter Spider-Man staging a crime to incriminate the real Spider-Man, causing a game-wide police manhunt, Venom kidnapping Mary Jane, a plot to infect the people of New York with the symbiote, the team-up of Doc Ock and Carnage, as well as the simultaneous involvement of half of Spider-Man's rogues gallery. It's pretty nuts, and it never lets off the gas. It's a full-tilt, fun, ridiculous adventure brought together by some of the best vocal performances from any game of the era.
You and your wife are innocent, Parker. Our bad.
Our bad? Our bad? I'm gonna kill you!
Peter Parker! Just get me out of here now!
One of the things I really love about the story is how it feels like part of a larger universe in the same way as reading one of the comics might. Because while Spider-Man games are no stranger to having a rogues gallery of villains, very rarely do you see it where you actually get several characters from throughout the same universe as well, such as the Human Torch, Punisher, who stops just short of shooting Spider-Man by the way, Daredevil, or Captain America. It feels like a much more living, breathing world when you can just casually run into other superheroes like this. It really feels like part of a larger universe, but if there's one thing I can knock the story for, it's the fact that it feels fairly aimless. A lot of the game is spent running away from the cops or chasing down Venom, while these two mysterious figures stand off in the corner quietly plotting. If you cut out everything that has nothing to do with the main plot, you'd lose something like 80% of the game, but I guess it's unfair to judge it based on that, considering that this is trying to present itself as more of a day-in-the-life adventure of Spider-Man, where everything's kind of gone to hell at once, and then present that with a singular overarching threat that occasionally rears its ugly head. And besides, this game is so ungodly fast-paced that it really doesn't give you time to even register some of this stuff happening, and fast-paced it certainly is. I managed to beat this game in just over 2 hours, but I've seen playthroughs go as low as 1.5 hours, and it's non-stop the entire time. Well, mostly. You find yourself running away from police helicopters, chasing Venom, dealing with time bombs during bank heists, getting to J. Jonah Jameson before he's killed by the Scorpion. This game is a never-ending barrage of ideas being thrown in your face for a level after level. That's something I very much appreciate about it, is that there's never a dull moment, and you're never quite sure what to expect as you're going through the game. It doesn't always quite land. The train level in particular has been fairly notorious, as the entire concept requires you to stay on the train car fighting lizard people, and if you fall off the train you have to restart the level from square one. And given how narrow the train car is, as you can imagine, this makes for a really obnoxious time. Although I managed to make it through it in one go this time, so maybe I'm just that good. And then there's also a few key moments where the pace drops, and when that happens, the game can get pretty boring, most notably in the sewer crawl where you have to find Venom by navigating a small maze. Granted, if you find the lizard, he'll tell you exactly where to go, and even then it's not a very big maze, so you can navigate it as well by brute forcing it, but it's still pretty agonizingly slow because you can mostly only navigate by crawling on the roofs, which is extremely slow. Swinging around fighting goons, that's fun. Laboriously climbing things is not, which is also why I'm not too fond of that one level where you have to climb a dilapidated building to get away from a helicopter, especially because it's not immediately obvious where the missiles are going to go, so it's very easy to take critical damage. And another thing that makes the climbing arduous is that for some reason, as you're transitioning between walls and roofs, your controls will randomly reverse and unreverse in such a way that makes it really confusing to control. I'm sure this was done to compensate for something, but it just makes the controls more awkward than they would have otherwise been. But I digress. The game as it sits is somewhat indicative of its time, being what is essentially an action platformer. Here's your action, and here's your platforming. But obviously, what elevates this game above other action platformers of the time are the unique Spider-Man aspects. Instead of simply jumping from perch to perch, you utilize web swinging and wall crawling to travel from place to place, which may seem functionally identical, but the semi-automated nature of the web swinging and the auto-stick nature of wall crawling means that they're able to have much more precarious level design and much more narrow platforms that would otherwise be frustrating to navigate if you didn't have a way to save yourself. And the web swinging is by no means fully automated, it's still very easy to blow it. It's a happy middle ground between giving the player agency while also making it easy to keep the pace up, and as I said, the pace in this game is paramount. The other aspect of the gameplay is how the web-based attacks play into the combat, and while the combat is definitely the most janky aspect of the game, especially with the fiddly pre-dual analog camera and a lack of any sort of lock-on feature, which makes it even odds whether or not you'll even web an enemy or web 6 feet to the left of them. Despite all that, the combat is still very fun, with various punch, kick, and web combos that you can mix and match by switching up your button inputs. And while they're all functionally the same, the combat is definitely more about the flair than the pure skill. And for what it's worth, I never got tired of web yanking people off buildings or shooting them with a web ball, although this game features a limited supply of webbing, so you have to be careful as not to run out. You can even grapple enemies, which I didn't know until this very playthrough, although that's probably because getting close enough to grapple an enemy is pointless when you can just web them or even punch them from further away. But the combat is still pretty varied and carries enough visceral impact that I can enjoy it, although I'd say by the time you get to the late game, the main enemies by that point, the symbiotes, are kind of obnoxious because they have no stun frames, and if they decide to stick to the ceiling, they're entirely invincible during that animation. But thankfully in a lot of cases you can just run past these guys if you don't feel like dealing with them. And by this point in the game they also give you these flame power-ups which are super fun to use and are almost an instant kill to these symbiotes. Usually the goal in the levels with the symbiotes is to destroy the machine spawning them, or by hitting a bunch of switches to rescue some hostages. As a matter of fact, by that point you're already 80% of the way through the game, so whatever frustration you get by fighting these guys is short-lived. So you fight into the underground facility, and it all culminates with a boss fight with Doc Ock, which is okay, a boss fight with Carnage, which is arduous, and then finally the final boss, for the lack of a better term, Monster Ock. The monstrosity that combines Dr. Octopus and Carnage into one remorselessly horrible being. I played this game for the first time when I was 16, and it scared me then, and honestly, this guy yelling at you to die in that strained, breathy way still gives me the creeps. He's too powerful to beat, so your only hope is to escape in a really tense and tightly timed escape sequence. It may be disappointing that this game doesn't end with a boss fight, but I actually think it's pretty fitting, given that it highlights that this is a creature that was so powerful that not even Spider-Man could stop it. And besides, the boss fights in these games have never really been the best. And then aside from a few humorous scenes where you get to watch Spider-Man play cards with the Punisher, Captain America, and Daredevil, followed by a very similar scene with all the villains, that's the end. While this game hasn't aged perfectly, there's still a lot of fun to be had, which is also why I'm quite happy that we got a sequel, Enter Electro. Now, the choice to make a sequel was a bit of an odd one considering it came out in 2001, late 2001, after the PS2 had already been out for almost a year. But I think it was pitched with the understanding that the PS2 may have been the new thing that everyone was excited for and wanted, but you could still play PS1 games on PS2, and many still had working PS1s kicking around. so it was a somewhat safe bet to make a PS1 exclusive to Spider-Man 2000, although there was a developer switch seeing as Neversoft was off continuing to raise the bar with the Tony Hawk skateboarding series exclusively, so they had to call in another developer. In this case, Vicarious Visions, who at this point was a somewhat unproven studio, largely relegated to budget games or Game Boy Color games. However, they made the Game Boy Color version of Spider-Man 2000, so I guess they were, by process of elimination, the ones to pick. This game is set almost immediately after the events of the previous game, and involves Electro stealing a device called the BioNexus device, which in their words has the power to amplify a regular person's bioelectric energy to the point of being able to power a city block. Sounds a bit like Infamous if you ask me. However, in the hands of Electro, it could make his power theoretically unlimited. So the fight is on to try and stay ahead of Electro and prevent him from completing the suit and being able to power it up. Which of course fails miserably, but we save the day in the end because we're just that good. One thing I will say about the plot of Enter Electro is it's much more centrally focused. Everything about this game ties into the larger plot of Electro attempting to amplify his powers via the stolen device. Everyone's in on the plan in some way, from Shocker to Hammerhead to Sandman. I'm not sure what any of these people are getting out of the deal other than killing Spider-Man, but I guess that's more than enough for some people. I will say though, seeing as a lot of the A tier and a good chunk of the B tier of villains were used up in the previous game, the villain selection in this game is comparatively weak. I mean, Electro as the main villain is already a bit of a stretch as he's B-list at best. Then some of the other villains are pretty notable, like Sandman and the Lizard, but then they got to such a degree of barrel scraping that they had to dig up the Beetle as one of the minor antagonists, and I didn't even know who that was before playing this game. Granted, the game basically forgets about the Beetle, which may be an indication that this game was slightly rushed, but it doesn't really matter. The character was so minor that the plot basically forgetting about him is pretty fitting all things considered. Though I'm surprised we never saw Green Goblin in either of these games, aside from an Easter egg in the first game. Presumably he was going to be the main villain of a hypothetical third game, but if a third game was ever meant to happen, it never really came to be because of the Sam Raimi movies monopolizing the Spider-Man video game thing for a few years. Still, I think the general plot is fun. Much of it is spent chasing down villains to try and figure out what the overall plan is, and the mystery unfolds naturally so that Spider-Man is learning the full extent of what we're dealing with alongside the player, keeping things naturally escalating, and once again, the performances are absolute aces. Especially the voice actor for Electro, who comes across as so unhinged and adds just the right amount of cockiness and whininess that it makes him absolutely grating to listen to, but in a good way.
Give me the jewel, Spider-Man! Give me the jewel, or this one dies!
Okay, how about a trade?
Throw the jewel and I'll send the doc. I can fry her before she ever reaches you.
Let's hope you're wrong, Electro.
The main way that Enter Electro differs from its predecessor is that Enter Electro has a much more leisurely pace. The previous game had all these fast-paced chase sequences that, depending on your standpoint, were either obnoxious or exhilarating, whereas this game tends to eschew that style of gameplay, even though at various points it's demonstrated that Spider-Man is still wanted by the police, so that should have probably been sorted out at some point. Regardless, there's only a few instances where the game forces you to pick up the pace, and more often than not, they give you more than enough time to work with, but there are a lot more levels that are simple A to B navigation. You may need to flip some switches or solve a puzzle or two, but more often than not, there's a lack of urgency. But with that, there's also a number of levels that feel more free and open to navigate. The second level in particular has it where you're in a chunk of the New York waterfront and have to explore to find a few crimes to stop. Also, you can try and sink this basket, though I found myself unable to do so. Full disclosure, while I didn't play the first game until I was a teenager, this is the one I grew up with, and I remember swinging around this little map for ages as a kid, cause this was as close to a sandbox game as I was gonna get for the time. But I also love the atmosphere of this level, and of the entire game if I'm being honest. This game has a mood. I will say the amount of creativity on display is still the same, it's just displayed in a different, less exciting way. like having that vertical obstacle course, or when they give you several opportunities to play the game entirely stealthily to the point there's even a stealth tutorial. Of course, this game is still no stranger to the eye-rollingly terrible level, most notably the wind tunnel level, also known as Crash Flight in some versions. This is a level where you have to stop a plane that's moving at probably less than 10 miles per hour, but will still violently explode if it has any sort of head-on impact. So you have to stop both of its propellers. However, you need to stop them evenly, otherwise the plane will veer off and crash into a wall. It's insanely frustrating because even though it's going slow, it's still going fast enough that readjusting yourself and aiming towards the plane is a long enough process that you'll usually end up getting run over, which wastes precious time. Though in fairness, something I didn't realize until afterward, this game actually does have a lock-on unlike the first game. It's just not very good at communicating these things, though I remember looking back from when I was playing this game as a kid that this was a thing. I just forgot it was a thing until I was reminded about it. Then you also have the level where you have to climb up a massive vertical shaft while Electro is raining Zeus's fury on top of you, and one mistake will send you back to the bottom more often than not. This is a really arduous mission that forces trial and error. I wasn't a fan of it when God of War did it, and I'm still not a fan here. There's also the level where you have to catch up to a train leaving the platform, but meanwhile you also have to fight the Sandman who puts up giant walls of sand in your way. This one always frustrated the hell out of me, especially because he can warp right on top of you, which will make whatever you're carrying break, and there's only a limited amount of things that you can throw at the walls of sand, so if you run out of things nearby you may need to backtrack, which only wastes more precious time that you need in order to catch the train before it leaves the station. Suffice it to say, this is always an intense ride, but never has it been intense in the fun way. It feels like walking up a muddy hill in roller skates, which is funny because the only thing that comes of this is your one and only face-to-face with the Beetle. Granted, that does lead you to the Science and Industry Ball where the creator of the BioNexus device, Dr. Watts, is, but, you know, baba booey. But despite the at times frustrating design, the general combat is still as stimulating as it was before, with all the same variety and impact that you knew and loved. The combat has been changed up a bit, like instead of having the web flip attack being a 3-hit combo, now it's a 2-hit combo, which took a bit of getting used to. But either way, the combat is still just as good as the first game, if not a little bit better. I feel like the camera movements have been smoothed out quite a bit, making the combat feel slightly less janky. Plus, I like that the game gives you more of a chance to do pure combat, because this is a game that also features more general combat missions where you just have to fight a load of goons within an enclosed space. Although usually I just default to whatever is easiest, meaning in this case the jump kick, which kills some enemies in one hit. This attack is even overpowered when you're fighting Electro in the penultimate level before the final boss. The final boss itself is a bit odd because last time Monster Ock was so powerful that Spider-Man had to run away, but now Electro has fully powered himself up and is functionally invincible, and yet we fight him head on. Also, fun fact, some versions of this game feature the Twin Towers in the final boss, and others don't as it was patched out shortly after release due to obvious reasons. I completely spaced on the fact that I downloaded the version that had them, which is why there was a couple of times during this boss fight that I got an extremely morbid chuckle. Either way, it's a pretty easy fight all things considered. All you need to do is destroy the generators on top of the tower so he can't recharge his health, and then trick him into attacking one of these things, which will leave him vulnerable. Do that a couple of times and Spider-Man will do his best misquoting of Spaceballs.
This goes to show that good wins because evil is dumb.
And that's that. You get a much more low-key ending this time around. This game's gang of villains lament their fate in jail, notably while sitting right across from all the villains in the first game. Meanwhile, Spider-Man quietly swings away into the morning sunrise, and I guess that kinda plays into another issue I have with this game, which is that it doesn't feel quite as much like it's part of a larger universe as much as the first game. Because aside from Beast from the X-Men and also Rogue and Professor X in the training mode, there really aren't any cameos in this game, so it feels much more closed off, which is disappointing, and I have no idea why that's the case. But c'est la vie, that's the end of this continuity of games. Most people will say that the first game is the better of the two. Well, personally, I think they're both roughly on the same level, but I think Enter Electro just edges out the first game in this case, mostly because while it was less exciting than the last game, it also felt much more refined, which counts for a lot. The first game required the pace to be quick in order for the flaws to go unnoticed, whereas Enter Electro, I feel, makes enough improvements that it can get away with being a little bit more slow-paced thanks to the refinement. But I don't think either of these games are bad in any way. In fact, I'd say both these games are great, but there's one specific point I'd like to highlight. Both these games have a significant amount of extra content that you can unlock and play around with. You can learn a lot about Spider-Man and of Marvel history by playing these games, or you can just play around in any number of historical suits that each have their own distinct abilities. Well, some of them do. Or you can create your own combination of suits and abilities. At the end of the day, what I think really stands out about these two games is just how much love they have for the comics. I spent ages going through the alternate costumes and unlockable historical tidbits where they document all the little milestones in the history of Spider-Man and in many ways comics generally. Of course, this is all fairly outdated given that a lot of comic history has taken place in the last couple decades, but I feel that's what really stands out about these games. Comics in general these days have become much more mainstream because of how large the superhero movie genre has become, with Avengers Endgame being within spitting distance of the #1 movie of all time. Something like that would have been completely unthinkable back in 2000 or 2001. As a matter of fact, with the absolute burnout that was Batman and Robin practically killing the superhero movie genre for a couple of years, these games kinda came out in a bit of a dead zone when comics generally were at a low point and the mainstream perception of the entire concept of superheroes were abysmal. General audiences didn't have respect for it, Hollywood didn't have respect for it, so it's neat to see that these games are not only fun in their own right and just so happen to star a superhero, but also have so much respect for the history of these characters. Sure, there may have potentially been good superhero games before this, but to me, this is the first time where it truly felt like the creators loved the property and weren't just designing a game. Any developer with skill can make a good game. But to make a good game that pays respectful homage to the property it's representing, that is something you can't get by simply being talented, and what's more is that this was during a time when comics were seen as simply uncool. It's a lot easier to get immersed in the culture these days, but back then, it would have been almost expected if Neversoft and Vicarious Visions didn't really care about these properties one way or the other. But they went the extra mile where they wouldn't have needed to. And that right there is why I consider these two games the first great comic book games, and not just games that happen to be based on comics. And that is also why I consider these games the predecessors to the modern Spider-Man games, not for the fact that they're necessarily similar, but they both invoke the same spirit, and the feeling that the people behind this loved what they were making, because these games are just riddled with Easter eggs and historical info. Insomniac Games love Spider-Man, and it shines through in every aspect of their presentation. That is why I consider these games spiritual successors, for the pure love of Spider-Man, before and after it was cool. That's all I've got. If you like what I do here and want to support the channel, you can pledge to my Patreon for unique perks and rewards such as early access, Discord benefits, exclusive content, and more, along with these fine folks right here. And an extra special thank you to Billy Knott, Brooklyn, Gaw004, Layabout, My Name is Tank, Raph, Ty Trovey, and Weird Webster for going above and beyond. And if you want to support the channel non-financially, you can like this video, leave a comment telling me what you think, subscribe, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing, as I'm still pretty sure YouTube isn't publishing my content into people's feeds. I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends. I am riding a giant banana. Your opinion is invalid.